Okay, in this lecture of this module, we're going to be discussing education. So when we think about education, again, another very important social institution, one of the larger and broader elements of society that achieves a basic need of society, and that basic need is basically the transmission of knowledge and skills. So for a society to survive, there needs to be some way of not only creating new knowledge, but also then transferring that knowledge and those skills among the people of the society. Typically, when we talk about modern society, we definitely talk about the idea of a credentialing system of education. So in other words, if you think about a pre-industrial society, education was basically just handing information to the people, so to the people that are coming up next. But there wasn't necessarily a system of making people earn what we call credentials. So if you think about hunter-gatherer societies and you wonder how a child learned to hunt, it was probably because then the adults of the society gave them those skills and knowledge, but there wasn't an idea then that they in any way had to then, other than just being able to demonstrate the ability to use that information, have like what we would call a credential. In modern society, we use things like diplomas and degrees to signify levels of education and types of education. And again, those can be then used as a type of sorting device within a complex society to determine eligibility for different types of employment. So we can definitely say you need a high school diploma to get certain types of education, and those people who haven't achieved that level might not be eligible for some jobs. Clearly, many of you know about this, being in college. You are achieving or working to achieve a college education, which will result in an associate's or bachelor's degree, which then will open up more doors for employment, different types of jobs. And then, of course, we can talk about master's and doctorate degrees. So all these are various levels of credential which help society as a whole. Basically, what we're talking about when we talk about the relationship between the economy and education, employers rely on educational institutions to provide people not only with knowledge and skills, but also develop systems for then credentialing those people so that employers can sort through the available workforce and determine who they consider to be appropriate employees for the types of jobs that they have. So when we take a look at education, again from the three main theoretical perspectives, we can take a look at it again from a functional theory, and we can look at, again, education being a very important social institution, and what functions then does this education provide to society. One of the things we can definitely talk about is the idea of a cultural transmission of values. Again, values are those things which are very important ideas, foundational ideas to what a society believes is desirable. And so we can definitely say that clearly functionalism would say one of the things that education does is transmit skills and knowledge, but these would be some of the other functions produced by or provided by education. When we talk about this idea of cultural transmission of values, those things that are important to society, we realize that the type of education that a society provides for us often reinforces society's most important values. So if we think about, again, just modern America, and we realize that things like progress, achievement, efficiency, these are all ideas which we could also associate with the economic system of capitalism, and we would definitely say that most of us grew up those of us who attended schools in the United States would probably say that you were transmitted the value that capitalism is a superior economic system. So we grow up in a capitalist society, we learn about capitalism. It's probably kind of rare, at least until we got to maybe, for many people, secondary school, later high school, but some of you maybe not until college were ever educated about socialism or other types of economic systems like we said, until much later in life. So in a sense, those cultural values that are prized by society are the ones that we're most often brought up in. Again, issues like patriotism. Again, we talk about the idea of students pledging allegiance at the beginning of every day. Well, that's a very important cultural value, patriotism, loyalty to the system. So these are things that the educational system, besides transmitting skills and knowledge, also instills in us knowledge of the values that our society highly prizes. We can definitely say that social integration is a very important function of education, in the sense that, once again, it's an agent of socialization that in a lot of ways our experience in the educational system to a large degree, in some ways, sometimes defines how integrated into society we are. So again, we could say that identify with the social institutions that exist in society. Society will tell us, how it works, and that the more on board we are with it, the more likely we are then to be fully integrated into the society. We can also talk about gatekeeping. This is related somewhat to the idea of credentialing. In a functional view, we've already talked about the idea that functional view of society is that there's many different roles in society to play, and they're valued differently, and some people, not everybody, will necessarily get into every occupation in society. And when we talk about that idea of gatekeeping, that's exactly the metaphor is that there are gates, and education opens some gates to some people into occupations that are closed off to other people. So we talk about the idea of, again, kind of tracking people throughout their lives and providing them with credentials which will allow them to occupy a place in society. And then we, of course, anytime we talk about functionalism, we can also point out, are there dysfunctions sometimes associated with education? Some of the things that we talk about is, are, in our society, clearly a society which is relying more and more and more on education, are in some ways education replacing some of the functions that were once performed by families. We could certainly say that at an earlier time in society, people spent a lot less time engaged in or in educational institutions they do in modern societies. So sometimes we actually think about education, especially modern schools, as being a primary, in a sense, a type of daycare. Whereas, especially in families with two working parents, that education and educational institutions spend much more time providing supervision and activities for children that were once pretty much the main function of a family. Along those lines, we can also point to things that were sometimes considered to be exclusively within the realm of the family. A good example is sex education. We more often think about now, while research has definitely said parents overwhelmingly say that sex education should be taught at home in the context of the family. Research then that asks children where they got most of their information will generally almost always say that they learned most of their sexual knowledge at school. So we can definitely say that in some ways many aspects of growing need for education in a modern society is in some way replacing some of the functions of the family. We can take a look at education from a conflict theory point of view. Again, conflict theory is going to point out the inequalities within a system. Clearly, conflict theorists will say that education systems tend to reproduce the social class structure that already exists, as well as perpetuates the inequality that already exists in society. So social or conflict theorists will look at, again, the differences between the very rich and the very poor, and point out that the educational system serves to perpetuate that system and reproduce it. Sometimes, again, the discussion of a hidden curriculum within modern education which serves to reinforce the status quo. In other words, conflict theorists would point almost in the sense of the divine right of kings or the control of ideology, that our education system teaches us about how society is and then reinforces the idea that that's the only way society could be, or that is the ideal way. So in other words, we look around us, we see society functioning in a specific way, and we accept that that's the way society is. Certainly we can talk about the idea of education, and we often hear about this when we talk about testing, especially testing done on a standardized or mass scale, that there's definitely pointed out there's cultural biases, and we've often sometimes heard mostly about ethnic or racial biases, but in general we can definitely look and see that it's almost beyond question that there are certainly cultural biases that exist within standardized testing. Again, for instance, we could say that people who are likely to score on standardized testing, such as SATs, GREs, those kind of things, are much more likely to have an understanding of the culture of the upper classes than people who come from lower classes. Famous example of this was an SAT question, which the analogies, something is to something as something is to something else, and you have to make the comparison, where the first part of it might be conductor is to orchestra, or conductor is to symphony as something else, and you might say that there's a cultural bias to that people of an upper education or upper class are much more likely to understand the relationship between a conductor and a symphony, or even know what those words are, than something else which is just as completely adequate an analogy, such as MC is to rap as or hip hop as conductor is to orchestra. The analogy is still the same, but the language used is going to reflect the cultural bias or the cultural reflection of the people making up the test in the first place. And of course we can definitely study things like college entrances and the levels of different types of education among colleges, and to the degree to which family background or social class plays a part in who will attend what colleges. So those all are under the again the influence or the umbrella of conflict theory. When we talk about symbolic interactionists, we would take a look again at the symbols. We've discussed this earlier when we were talking about socialization and labeling theory. Sometimes the relationship between teachers and students will give us some pretty good ideas about how students, even as children, get a quote-unquote kind of an identity impressed on them by teachers, and that these labels can actually become in some ways self-fulfilling prophecies. So in other words, a child labeled as a troublemaker, or other children conversely being labeled as smart, as opposed to underachievers or problem children. So we have all these different labels, these symbols, which sometimes get into the education system and influence people's behavior, teachers and students. We definitely know, and research has definitely pointed out, that sometimes different types of students send out different signals to teachers, which teachers are more receptive to. So in other words, things like eye contact, or paying attention, or participation. And we typically think of these as pretty positive things, but when teachers pay more attention or give more positive reinforcement to students that engage in those behaviors, and then conversely either punish or don't pay as much attention to students who don't know how to send those signals, then we can see, again, a difference in the way students are being educated within the system. So again, those of you interested in a career in education can clearly benefit from learning about more sociology and research, sociological research that's been done. Clearly we can also point out a lot of problems, especially in the modern American system of education. We can point out things like grade inflation. Again, while schools are under more and more pressure to promote and graduate a greater number of students, sometimes with limited resources or dropping resources. We can talk about the idea of grade inflation, where just like the economic idea of inflation, if there's not enough money and you print more money, then the money becomes worth less. So in situations where, again, grades are usually the standard A, B, C, D, F format, so a teacher might be under more and more and more pressure to advance more and more students, so therefore give out more and more, let's say, A's and B's. Then conversely, those A's and B's which are being given out on a greater basis, conversely, are worth less. So we sometimes point to the idea that what might have been considered a C student 50 years ago may actually have more skills than a student who's being passed with straight A's today, because of the idea of grade inflation. That's just one hypothesis, which also leads then to the idea sometimes of social promotion, which is the idea, and you've probably heard negative stories, clearly it's considered largely negative, about students kind of being just pushed through or promoted through the system without actually demonstrating the kind of skills that would actually earn them the kind of credentials that we're talking about. So again, keeping, not wanting to hold a student back because that'll put them at an age disadvantage or an age advantage in some cases to the students in the other grades, or that once they've failed 2 grades, then it's policy to promote them. And again, sometimes when we talk about as a product of that, we're producing more and more people in our society who might be functionally illiterate. In other words, they might have a high school diploma, but not be able to read. Certainly issues of violence in schools is concerning to many people, and of course research has been done to address that issue. And again, when we talk about negative influence of peers on people's behaviors, clearly schools and education are one of the places in society where that is very likely to